Welcome to Readers of the Lost Art with your presenter, Dr. Paul Anthony Taylor, a recovering academic. And the title of today's talk is Christopher Nolan's Memento of Shakespeare's Hamlet. He is walking around, nothing more, reading the book of himself. Stefan Mallarmé. And yet, when all is said, it was the dream itself enchanted me. Character isolated by a deed to engross the present and dominate memory. Players and painted stage took all my love, and not those things that they were emblems of. William Butler Yeats. Hi everybody, and this is the mishmash of things I'll be looking at today. What I want to do is look at the film Memento, but I apologise in advance, it's not going to be a deep dive into the very specific features of the film, because I want to do that on a separate occasion to do it full justice. Likewise, I want to, when I do the full deep dive, I want to do an even deeper dive into the play Hamlet, and really go into the mechanics of both the Hamlet play and the film Memento. And James Joyce's Ulysses is such a sprawling, epic, brilliant novel that could take years to do that justice. But I want to refer to it today just to show you some of the reverberations and echoes. How Memento by Christopher Nolan, even though it never mentions Hamlet once, I'm going to argue is a brilliant, in a certain sense, adaptation of Hamlet, Shakespeare's play. And this all relates to the ongoing project to prepare the ground for when Christopher Nolan's epic film Ulysses, The Odyssey comes out in July. Because I think I've expressed before, I have my doubts because it's such a direct adaptation of the Homer's epic that I really struggle to see how it's going to work. I'm really happy to be proved wrong, but I just don't see how it's going to work. Whereas the irony or the paradox I'm pointing to with his early film, I think it was his second feature film, Memento, is that he never attempts directly to embody the spirit of Hamlet, but actually, in practice, that's what happens, as I will attempt to show. And in Ulysses by James Joyce, Ulysses is obviously the Latinized version of Odysseus in the Odyssey, and this goes directly to the issue of adaptation, because James Joyce almost superimposed, he had this schema that's not actually mentioned in Ulysses, that there aren't chapter divisions, there aren't section divisions, but he handed over with the publication of the book, afterwards, the schema of how he saw it mapping onto the concept of the Odyssey by Homer. So there are various correspondences, and within that, so that's how it relates to Christopher Nolan, but within that, there's section 9, Scylla and Charybdis, which is a story within the Odyssey. James Joyce has his character Stephen Dedalus discussing Hamlet and an interesting theory about Hamnet, the son of William Shakespeare, who died when he was 11 tragically. And I will go on to describe and discuss briefly what I consider to be the truly horrific film Hamnet. So if you've watched Hamnet and you're a genuine fan, maybe this isn't the video for you. So I will not be offended at all if you depart at this point. Save yourself getting angry with me. But no, it truly, in my mind, is an atrocious film, and I will be venting like Victor Meldrew for British people who know who he is. So without more ado, I wanted to that was a Hamlet-like slip of the tongue. I should have said without more ado. But anyway, this is a quote. I like to involve the comment section of Readers of the Lost Art So the pseudonym being The Ballad of Pudding Quest. I won't inquire why. But this regular contributor, I thought, made a brilliant comment upon my previous video about the Odyssey and Christopher Nolan, and how you might try and adapt with the Odyssey. So to repeat, this is going to be about Memento, but the film Memento, you won't have to have seen it. I'll describe as much as you need to. It'd obviously be a benefit if you have seen it, but you don't need to have seen it to hopefully make sense of this video. So, as he says here, the voice of the poet is irrevocably bound to a specific place at a specific time. The written word can project and propagate an echo through space and across time, but films oddly seem to exist beyond space and out of time. Perhaps I just have a recency bias, but I'm inclined to agree that the Odyssey would seem stylistically antithetical to the medium of the feature film. So this, as I said, is what we're working towards, preparing the ground for the eventual appearance of this IMAX spectacular, The Odyssey. And like me, The Ballad of Pudding Quest here is questioning the suitability. And again, to repeat, sorry if I bang you over the head with this idea, but Memento, one of the reasons I think it's such a fascinating film, as I'll explain shortly, is that it really does suit and expand upon the specific possibilities of film and what film does best, without trying to be something it isn't. And I think that's what makes it a truly great film. I've always thought that the greatest assets of film as a medium is that perverse intimacy which allows the audience to be present without presence, and its power to alienate, disorient, and obscure through the meticulous framing and compositing of a dynamic scene on the audience's behalf. When the audience's vision competes with the artist, the illusion tends to fall apart, and so such adaptations often seem to succeed or fail based on their ability to transform the source, producing something separate and distinct, but still recognisable. And that's what I'm going to be arguing about Memento. Where it says, and so such adaptations often seem to succeed or fail based on their ability to transform the source. So if you hadn't thought about it, and you've seen Memento, I wouldn't be surprised at all if you'd never ever linked it to Hamlet, but it will be interesting to pursue the links as we go along. And this is the final bit from our mate Ballad of Pudding Quest. Whilst a great film adaptation can be complementary in contrast to its source, and that should, I'm bad on the typos today, that should not have the apostrophe, shame on me. In contrast to its source, revealing, reframing, or re-emphasizing particular aspects or features of an original work. It's the rare example that manages to successfully translate a work of art across media in any capacity, and presently I can think of none which do so in whole. I suppose at the very least one may anticipate a fruitful tension between an original work and a cross-media adaptation. And the key phrase I want to pick out there that I think is incredibly important is this phrase, a fruitful tension. Because I think at the root of most artistic creativity is this aspect of tension. The tension of a genre, for example, you're confined within a genre, and yet by battling as an artist within the confines, the tension of your attempt to make something of the genre is what can make brilliant art. So, with specific reference to Hamlet, Shakespeare was battling with the concept of it was a very common genre of the time, the revenge tragedy, and within those confines, yes, revenge is a major aspect of Hamlet the play, but he almost takes the genre and makes fun of it, because at the end there's just a sea of bodies, and the revenge just gets out of control, like Shakespeare had read Reservoir Dogs ahead of his time. And I'm sure Tarantino was affected by the end of Hamlet. But this idea that there is the audience had expectations of what a tragedy and a revenge tragedy particularly were, and Shakespeare actually undermines those. And I think it's an aspect of great artists. So, in the realm of film, I rate Hitchcock as a complete brilliant auteur artist. And one of my favourite films by him is Rear Window. And in Rear Window, within the confines of quite a claustrophobic film set, he shows you the voyeurism. He replicates the voyeurism of you in the cinema watching a film and transports it onto the main character. I think it's Scotty, isn't it? And who's looking voyeuristically out on this courtyard because he's broken his leg. So within the mystery detective type story, he plays with the genre and he's actually making fun of the audience as well for being voyeurs. And that it's that tension of not insulting your audience. I could probably learn from that, but playing with the confines of the genre and doing interesting things. And at the very end of Rear Window, I remember arguing with students because I think it's a very pessimistic, dark ending in the guise of a romantic ending. The Grace Kelly character has she's got a man, whereas you really could interpret it as Hitchcock's being. I hesitate to say misogynistic because I think it's sometimes a lazy accusation made against him, but the message of the film seems to be careful. This woman was all the time finagling so she could capture her man and stop his inquisitive spirit because Scotty is a photographic journalist. And that's the end message, but it's also couched in the terms of a very happy ending. And that's my point about tension. Hitchcock was very good at playing with that tension. Shakespeare, brilliant. And in Memento, the film, I think Christopher Nolan does an absolutely brilliant job of playing with the tension in cinema of the audience's expectations and also the role that time plays in cinematic scenes. So I'll be explaining the very complicated narrative structure of Memento. He plays with the chronology in a very inventive and clever way that actually addresses some of the issues in the previous two quotes from the Ballad of Pudding Quest. The idea of there's a certain fragmentation of and distance of cinema, and it's out of time and out of space. And actually, Christopher Nolan in Memento plays with that idea, I think, quite brilliantly. And in contrast to all those positive things I've said about great art, I watched this, and I must admit, I had to watch it over 2 nights, about an hour each time, because I couldn't take any more. I felt like I needed a crash helmet because I was going to get some type of concussion from being hit over the head with the less than subtle symbolism. And I'm going to talk about the role of translation in adaptations and the difference between the various art forms and how you use the content of one in a different medium. And I do think, I don't want to be accused of a hate crime, or any racist connotations, but I do think that the director, I think her original name was Zhao Ting, and she's known now in the West as Chloe Zhao. I do think she just, not being a native English speaker, I'm just wondering how much of her interpretation or her use of Shakespeare is based upon a bad translation. And this is one of the issues. I'm sure Italian people might feel a bit protective about Dante, and you could, Proust and the French perhaps. But I just think this director has taken everything that's complex and indecipherable and tension laden and difficult and turned it into the most saccharine. Is it agave syrup? What's that? There's an artificial, or there's a substance that's 20 times sweeter than sugar. It's just nauseatingly. It's both nauseatingly sentimental, as you can see from the film poster, and manipulative in ways that I found quite disturbing. But when I wasn't laughing, which we'll get into more later. But yes, if you haven't and you can see, are they Palm d'Ors, whatever there's awards, a couple of categories. This film won awards, which I think's an indictment of what illiterate times we live in. I think a major theme of this channel is cultural illiteracy, and to take as a major theme Hamlet and produce, I'm using a polite phrase, the illegitimate son of this film called Hamnet. Anyway, I'm just going to go off on one. So, Memento, and you can see from by contrast, this is a brilliant film poster because it portrays one of the major themes of Memento, which I will explore separately in future, the idea of the role of capturing reality through endlessly recessive, regressive images, in this case photographs. So the main character, I'm going to give you a précis of the plot in a second, but the main character has is an antegrade. It's a weird form of amnesia where he remembers incidents before a traumatic incident, but afterwards he can't form short-term memories of longer than about 10 or 15 minutes, depending upon how stressed he is. So he makes up for that by taking constant photographs. And I think it's an amazing commentary. It's really emblematic, this film, of arguably the status of people in a screen-based society. So you're the average person today constitutes so much of their experience through photographs or online notes to themselves or other people, in a way that is very reminiscent of this guy who's got no short-term memory. He lives in an eternal now and has to take constant photographs, tattoo himself, write messages, take photographs, write post-it notes to himself. And it just struck me, it's that type of mental condition. Christopher Nolan's portraying an extreme example of arguably what people in contemporary society are actually suffering from. So that's just one of the reasons I think it's a brilliant film. And one of the issues I wanted to look at today in relation to all this is the concept of translation. So this is just a stunningly good book that I again plan to look at in detail, because I think there are parts of this that apply directly to Memento. But the concept of translation, it also applies to the Hamlet thing, and also the Hamlet Memento, all these complex links, and also the Hamlet Ulysses Odysseus links. The idea in one of it's a very complicated, brilliant book, but one of the aspects that he's looking at, George Steiner, is that translation obviously occurs between languages, duh, but it also very much occurs within a language. So it's I think he calls it intra-translation as opposed to inter. An intra-translation within a language is because different societies and different cultural epochs use words differently. And yes, you're using the same basic language of English, but I'll give you examples later of how Shakespeare's using language in incredibly subtle ways, and he's using words with varying meanings depending upon the context he's choosing to use them in. And if anything, I remember studying Ovid's Metamorphoses and looking at the way in which the complexity of various techniques that Ovid used, and then you could, it's just beautifully layered use of language, and then you compare that with the vast majority of people now have lost that ability to write in certain literary ways. You read letters that people wrote from a few centuries ago, and there's a timbre, there's a quality to the writing that most people just cannot manage now. And I'm going to give you a specific example towards the end of this talk, linking it to the concept of Ulysses and James Joyce. There's a beautiful judgment by a district judge in America. Ironically, it was the day after Prohibition, the removal of Prohibition. I think it was 1933. The Prohibition Act stopping people drinking. What a time that would have been to be alive. The Prohibition Act was taken away, and the day after, this judge gave his judgment on whether the novel Ulysses by James Joyce would be allowed to be imported into the US because it was accused of obscenity and being pornographic. So he wrote this short judgment, which I'll be quoting from later on. And he's a judge, and it is written like a literary scholar. It is brilliant. The two elements, his appreciation of the literary qualities of Ulysses is exemplary, and he writes in a beautiful style, B, funny. And it's just I can't conceive of a modern politician or a modern judge writing to that level of to that degree. It's absolutely stunningly beautiful, and also, as a side note, has some very important implications for the concept of censorship, which is very topical in the UK at the moment, where you can get basically arrested for saying anything almost. But his the intersplicing, if that's a word, of the legal judgment and the literary appreciation, it's worth reading, for itself. But this, yeah, George Steiner, I think it's After Babel is if you have the chance, I thoroughly recommend you have a look at it, because he takes especially, I think, romantic poems in the first section and shows the way in which the language was used in very specific social context. And it's the downside and the beauty of studying literature. You get so much more out of it if you put the work in to understand the original context and its significance. And yes, of course, work from previous ages has modern resonance. And this is why I dislike the film Hamnet so much, because they've taken modern sensibilities, the love of certain demographics, of wonderfully romantic relationship focused movies, and that's the filter through which Hamlet, one of the most complicated plays and deep plays that's ever been written, that's what it's reduced to. So it's this translation in the wrong direction, rather than trying to understand the subtlety, the complexity, and the richness of the past. Hamnet is so emblematic of a time where everything has to be filtered through the here and now, which again is ironically what the character of Memento is battling with because of his short-term memory loss. And I'll quickly move on. I feel the rant within me. I need to control it. I'm still recovering from watching Hamnet. It really did. I've got PTSD. Have sympathy. This is another stunning book, and you may have come across Douglas Hofstadter before. I think, is it Gödel, Escher and Bach was one of his more famous books. He's brilliant polymath. He writes about very, very complex things in, I'm trying to think of a word, disparate sounds almost insulting. His books are like shaggy dog stories in the best possible way. I sounded like Kenny Everett then. In the best possible taste, they develop strands of thought that go out in all directions. And this was one, I think, I'm trying to remember when in this series of books this came, but I really do think this is his best book. And again, ironically, probably one of his least known. But it's all about one single poem, and it's an insignificant poem. It was written in 1537. It's a French poem by a guy called Clement Marot, M-A-R-T. And this phrase, Le Tombeau de Marot, is tombeau literally means beautiful tone. But to a French person, the word order would normally be le beau ton, the beautiful tone. So tombeau, and forgive my awful French pronunciation, but tombeau with an N sounds remarkably, it's a homonym, it sounds exactly the same to a French ear as tombeau, T-O-M-B-E-A-U, which means gravestone, and hence the image on the front. So you've gone from beautiful tone to tombstone, and there it's I think the French was à une demoiselle malade. It's to a sick young girl. He had there's a young girl who he was friends with, and he wrote she was ill, so he wrote her this relatively superficial poem just to cheer her up. And what Hofstadter does is, in various ways, keep retranslating it or looking at different translations of this relatively short poem. And you very quickly get this idea. There are almost limitless interpretations. It's a stunningly, the process by which he makes the translation and then proceeds to riff on the translation just shows you how it's almost infinite, that just the interpretation of language and the subtleties and the change of emphasis that you can make. And that complexity, that trying to rephrase or make sense in a different language, again reminds me of Memento, because this guy's got this memory loss and he's trying to make sense of what's going on around him. So the act of translation is a major theme of Memento. And likewise, it's a major theme in a way of Hamlet, because Hamlet's trying to make sense of his particular situation. He's trying to translate it into some type of emotional equilibrium that he fails to do. And yeah, it's both this and the George Steiner book, they stand in absolute opposition to the crime against culture that is Hamnet. That's again quickly moving on. But right, let's get stuck into Memento. Like I say, I'm just giving a really rough overview. But I promise, go do there's going to be a live stream where we discuss Memento. So I'm going to do at least one video before that. But Christopher Nolan's brother, Jonathan Nolan, wrote this short story, Memento Mori, reminder of death. In classical paintings, it's nearly always a skull that's supposed to remind us, and in Hamlet, Yorick's skull. And I mentioned earlier Rear Window. Rear Window was based upon a short story, and it does interest me. I have serious misgivings, as I've said, about the wisdom of making a film about Homer's epic, the Odyssey. But films do seem to develop short stories incredibly well. And maybe that's because short stories as a medium tend to condense a particular concept that films can then adapt more easily than the completely, all over the place complex narrative structure of an epic of all 24 books of the Odyssey. Likewise, for example, I think there has been a film made of James Joyce's Ulysses, but it just strikes me as such a silly thing to do because of its innate complexity. So I'll just quickly give you a taste. This isn't the whole short story, but just some key elements of the short story of the brother of Christopher Nolan upon which the film was based. And this is the interior monologue of a guy who's had this amnesiac condition. But you're different, you're more perfect. Time is three things for most people, but for you, for us, just one. A singularity, one moment, this moment, like you're the centre of the clock, the axis on which the hands turn. Time moves about you, but never moves you. It has lost its ability to affect you. What is it they say? That time is theft, but not for you. Close your eyes and you can start all over again. Conjure up that necessary emotion, fresh as roses. Time is an absurdity, an abstraction. The only thing that matters is this moment a million times over. You have to trust me. If this moment is repeated enough, if you keep trying, and you have to keep trying, eventually you will come across the next item on your list. No, your life is over. You're a dead man. The only thing the doctors are hoping to do is teach you to be less of a burden to the orderlies. And they'll probably never let you go home, wherever that would be. So the question is not to be or not to be, because you aren't. The question is whether you want to do something about it, whether revenge matters to you. It does to most people. For a few weeks they plot, they scheme, they take measures to get even, but the passage of time is all it takes to erode that initial impulse. Time is theft, isn't that what they say? And time eventually convinces most of us that forgiveness is a virtue. Conveniently, cowardice and forgiveness look identical at a certain distance. Time steals your nerve. So I love this. It's and you can just see, because I'm sure some people would argue it's a big stretch to say that Memento is strongly resonant with Hamlet, but there is this. It's a throwaway line, but the middle mini, I was going to say paragraph, but a couple of sentences here. So the question is not to be or not to be, because you aren't. This is the only allusion to Hamlet. It's in the story, the short story upon which the film Memento was based. So I'm totally willing to accept it's tangential, but that's what I love about it. It's like the film Memento is haunted by the ghost of Hamlet in just this little mention of it. And that's why I think it's a brilliant film, because this haunting element, like Ulysses, the novel, is haunted by the Odyssey. And yes, there's a structure that Joyce provided which makes the link to the Odyssey explicit. But actually, it's not highlighted. It's in your face in the actual novel. It's much more subtle. But this also, we're doing on the channel in the live stream Proust, à la recherche de temps perdu, in the third paragraph, all about time. I think it's a brilliant observation, the way in which you may think of yourself as a forgiving person, but he's pointing out, well, perhaps it's just because the moment for revenge slipped you by, and that's what made you forgive. Time steals your nerve. Cowardice and forgiveness look identical at a certain distance, and all these themes are relevant to Memento. And one of the aspects of Memento that I think is brilliant is when he says here, time steals your nerve. In order to keep his nerve, in order to keep in a vengeful frame of mind, the character in Memento has to trick himself into not finding out the real truth, but actually he tricks himself so that he can keep not being placated by time and being able to maintain a vengeful state. We'll find out later the reason for that, in my interpretation, is because he doesn't want to face up to what caused the trauma, the real cause. He's basically in denial, and he substitutes self-reflection for action, which is a complete mirror image of Hamlet, who substitutes action for, he uses self-reflection instead of action, until at the end there's this splurge of killing. So they're the mirror images. When I say there's resonance between Memento and Hamlet, in some sense they are the mirror image of each other. So this is again continuing from Memento Mori by Jonathan Nolan. What the hell do you need a watch for anyway? It was an antique, deadweight, tugging at your wrist, symbol of the old you, the you that believed in time. No, scratch that. It's not so much that you've lost your faith in time as that time has lost its faith in you. And who needs it anyway? Who wants to be one of those saps living in the safety of the future, in the safety of the moment, after the moment in which they felt something powerful, living in the next moment in which they feel nothing, crawling down the hands of the clock, away from the people who did unspeakable things to them, believing the lie that time will heal all wounds, which is just a nice way of saying that time deadens us. Brilliant. Very much not Hamnet. So, this is a movie poster that I've summarizes this idea of. Remember the previous quote from Memento Mori I've just given you about you get to the next thing on your list. This is how he has to live his life. He has to keep reminding himself. And as I said earlier, this is like, online WhatsApp groups and so on, in my mind. The constant activity, the constant short-term reminders. And the story is, I'll give you in a second, there's a plot summary, but basically the story is his wife, and this is all what he thinks happened, which I need to emphasize, but there's a home invasion. He's sleeping. His wife is attacked and assaulted in the bathroom. He shoots and kills one of the intruders, and he's hit over the head, and this is what causes his amnesiac trauma. And from then on, the last thing he remembers is the home invasion, and he can't form short-term memories after that. But what I said earlier about him being in denial, his wife, his relationship with his wife is alluded to in flashbacks during the film, but they're ambiguous. Ironically given to a man who now deals in facts and photographs and facts that he writes down or tattoos on himself. He's actually suppressing, I think, memories of how the relationship with his wife actually was. So this is a summary. A guy called Andy Klein. I've put a link in the description box to various resources, and where this was taken from is also in the description. Leonard Shelby is a former insurance investigator. In his previous life, intruders assault and kill his wife one night. He kills one of them, but the other one bonks him on the head and gets away. The injury leaves him suffering from a condition called anterograde amnesia, which means that he can't create new long-term memories. Leonard can remember everything prior to the accident since his old long-term memories are still intact, but his current attention span lasts roughly 15 minutes, and even less when he's stressed or distracted. And in no case can any of these current memories be permanently implanted in his brain. Since he can't experience the passage of time, his wife's death is always fresh to him, and so he's passionately determined to find the remaining intruder and kill him. He reminds himself of what he's doing through a series of notes, a pocket full of Polaroid snapshots with helpful information written on them, and for really important stuff, tattoos. We see that he's developed a number of clues to the killer's identity, each of these burned onto his body. As the movie lurches backward, we see how and where he gleans each piece of the puzzle. Difficult to say that. So sorry, I'll go back to this. To prefigure some of the links to Hamlet, there's a quote in Hamlet, "The time is out of joint." And this is what Memento's all about. And one of the very clever, imaginative things in Memento is the way the chronology works, is that there are two different formats. One is there are colour film they're in reverse order. So the actual individual segment plays in normal time, but they're shown in reverse order. So you're going backwards in time with each segment. So, the previous segment gives you more context as to what you've seen to start off with. But then interspersed within that are black and white segments, which is time moving forward in a normal chronological fashion. So you've got time going backwards in the colour film and time going forwards in the black and white. And they're really cleverly integrated into the film as a whole. So before we go back to Memento, I wanted to explore why I'm arguing that it's linked to Hamlet. And to do that perversely, I'm showing you Ulysses, because remember, Christopher Nolan is doing the Odyssey. So I really like this cover to the Penguin edition. They're called, that tower is called a Martello Tower. And I think it was William Pitt the Younger, but it was 1805-ish. They were used as fortifications against Napoleon. So this is the southern coast of Dublin. So to keep tabs on the French. And this is just from one of the characters. From memory, this is from the very beginning of the book. I mean to say, Haynes explained to Stephen as they followed, this tower and these cliffs here remind me somehow of Elsinore. That beetles o'er his base into the sea, isn't it? And that beetles o'er his base into the sea, it just means a cliff that's overhanging, but it also implies if you stood on an overhanging cliff, you have this sense of losing, falling over, losing your mind in a way. So right from the beginning, and the book starts with the characters they're staying, which happened in real life to James Joyce. He stayed. It's called Sandy Cove, Martello Tower, which is the location of this particular Martello Tower. And Joyce stayed in it. But this, you can see the explicit reference to Elsinore. And this is obviously from the Irish Tourist Board. You can hear the violin music in the background. Ah, diddly 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 dee. But a beautiful picture of the bay. And that is, I think that is the Sandy Cove Martello Tower. And there it is again. This black and white atmospheric picture. Oh, and this is, forgive me, so this is the tower. I wanted to give you a short segment. It's just my sense of humour, but this is from the biography of James Joyce, and I think it's recognised as probably the most substantial and significant biography, unless I'm out of touch. But this is Richard Ellman's James Joyce. So this is a true story. During the night of the Trench and Samuel Trench and Oliver St. John Gogarty are two real-life friends of James Joyce. Oliver St. John Gogarty was a surgeon, and he's the basis for the character called Buck Mulligan, who's a larger-than-life character. And Samuel Trench is the character in the book called Haynes, which in French is hate. La haine is hatred. So, and he was this Anglo-Irish guy. He was Irish by birth, but spent most of his life in England, and had this, I think, chip on his shoulder because of it. And he was trying to learn Gaelic to partially make up for it. But anyway, during the night of September 14th, Trench began to scream in his sleep. He was convinced that a black panther was about to spring. Half waking, he snatched his revolver and shot at the fireplace beside which Joyce was sleeping. After having dispatched his prey, he turned back to sleep. Whilst Joyce trembled, Gogarty seized the gun. Then Trench, again ridden by nightmare, screamed and reached again for his revolver. Gogarty called out, "Leave him to me," and shot, not the panther, but some pans hanging above Joyce's bed, which tumbled down on the recumbent poet. The terrified Joyce considered this fusillade his dismissal. Without a word, he dressed and left, having at that hour to walk all the way to Dublin, which was a bloody long walk. He sent a note to James Starkey asking him to pack his trunk at the tower so it could be picked up on the day following. And I love this throwaway sentence at the end. Perhaps all grand gestures end with someone else packing the trunk, which I think is a wonderful quote for our times. And just, this is a complete, for American viewers, this is called Elsinore Arch, because we mentioned Elsinore with reference to the Martello Tower. This is in Cincinnati, Ohio. It was built in 1883, which by American standards is ancient, isn't it? And after, I think what happened was the architect who built this had been to a play, a performance of Hamlet, and it was a big deal because I think the actor who was playing Hamlet, even though he was quite old, so it wasn't really appropriate, but he was a very famous actor and he'd come home. He was a local and he'd come home, so the architect was at that play and it made a big impression on him. So this is a valve house for, I think it's for a reservoir or a water. It's the water company, and it's what they called a valve house, and this is what they made it look like. So I'm just going to give you examples now. This is the section from Ulysses. I want to develop the Hamlet, and towards the end I'll make the links between the Hamlet and Memento again. So I did say at the beginning there's this jumble, this complex interrelationship between Ulysses, Hamlet, Memento, and all these layers of resonance. So Scylla and Charybdis, I'll explain all this when I do a proper session on Ulysses, but that they're basically it's from the phrase a rock and a hard place. Scylla, if I've got it the right order, that it was a six-headed monster who, I hope I haven't got it back to front, had six-headed monster who'd eat six men at a time, and Charybdis was this whirlpool that sucked ships down, and you had to navigate through the two of them. And in this section, so that's what's the section is nominally called by Joyce, but you don't see it in the actual novel. It's what the schema he provided afterwards. So that has symbolic significance because Stephen Dedalus, who's giving this talk about Hamlet, has to steer between opposing people who were responding to his lecture. But he says this, as we, or Mother Dana, who's, I think it's the Celtic goddess, like Mother Earth, weave and unweave our bodies, Stephen said, from day to day, their molecules shuttle to and fro. So does the artist weave and unweave his image. And as the mole on my right breast is where it was when I was born, though all my body has been woven of new stuff time after time, so through the ghost of the unquiet father, the image of the unloving son looks forth. In the intense instant of imagination, when the mind, Shelley says, is a fading coal, that which I was is that which I am, and that which in possibility I may come to be. So in the future, the sister of the past, I may see in myself as I sit here now, but by reflection from that which then I shall be. So it's beautiful, but he's just talking about how we change over time, but we're still the same person. And when Memento is about this guy who's not changing through time in the sense he only has short-term memory, and he's almost exacerbated that situation by, as I'll explain later, or I referenced earlier, he lies to himself at the end of the film so he can continue being vengeful rather than face up to the inner truths. But so through the ghost of the unquiet father, so this is a direct reference to Hamlet. The image of the unliving son looks forth. So it's all about, there's ghosts, the hauntings of your father, as Hamnet hits you over the head endlessly, also the ghost of a lost child. All these things are going on, and this is the way in which Stephen Dedalus in this section of Ulysses discusses it. And he goes on to say, if the shrew is worsted, so he has this, I should explain, I'll read this and then I'll carry on. If the shrew is worsted, yet there remains to her woman's invisible weapon. There is, I feel in the words, some goad of the flesh driving him into a new passion, a darker shadow of the first, darkening even his own understanding of himself. A like fate awaits him, and the two rages commingle in a whirlpool. So it's a complex argument, but basically it has this really odd interpretation of Shakespeare's life in relation to Hamlet. The shrew he's referring to is Anne Hathaway, Shakespeare's wife, and Stephen Dedalus in the book, and there are debates whether James Joyce believed it himself, but he's putting forward the idea that Anne Hathaway was older than Shakespeare, and basically she seduced him. So it wasn't the romantic love fest that occurs in Hamnet. And he argues that Shakespeare never recovered from it, and that explains some of his psychopathologies. So this is the idea that even if, if the taming of the shrew, I'm assuming is being referred to here, the idea that Shakespeare wrote some, you know, plays critical of women, but he's saying here, Stephen Dedalus, that even if the shrew is worsted, in other words, got the better of, yet there remains to her woman's invisible weapon. And he's suggesting that deep within Shakespeare was this darker shadow of the first. So the passion he had was overshadowed by a darker shadow, darkening even his own understanding of himself. And the reference to the whirlpool. They list, and in the porches of their ears I pour. The soul has been before stricken mortally, a poison poured in the porch of a sleeping ear. But those who are done to death in sleep cannot know the manner of their quell, unless their Creator endow their souls with that knowledge in the life to come. The poisoning and the beast with two backs, that's a phrase used in Othello, that urged it. King Hamlet's ghost could not know King Hamlet's ghost could not know of were he not endowed with knowledge by his Creator. That is why the speech, his lean, unlovely English, is always turned elsewhere, backward. So he's talking about King Claudius, the ghost. Sorry, not King Claudius. King Hamlet, Hamlet Senior, talking to Hamlet Junior about the usurper, King Claudius, his brother who's taken his wife. He goes back weary of the creation he has piled up to hide from himself, an old dog licking an old sore. But because loss is his gain, he passes on towards eternity in undiminished personality, untaught by the wisdom he has written or by the laws he has revealed. His beaver is up, in other words, his helmet, he's lifted the lid at the front. He is a ghost, a shadow now, the wind by Elsinore's rocks or what you will, the sea's voice, a voice heard only in the heart of him who is the substance of his shadow, the Son, consubstantial with the Father. So this link they have, the Father talking to the Son. But this description of Hamlet Senior, the ghost, again, for those familiar with Memento, I'd suggest this description of this ghost-like personality that doesn't learn, untaught by the wisdom he has written or by the laws he has revealed. He passes on towards eternity in undiminished personality. His personality isn't changing. He's trapped in this purgatorial loop, which is what the character from Memento is. And now just to this is deliberately complicated, just to give you a sense. This is the anti-Hamnet detail and information. So in that section, Stephen Dedalus is talking, and he is a very Hamlet-like character. A hyper-rational, highly educated, searching for meaning. Portrait of an artist as a young man, he's the main character. And he leaves to Paris and ends up coming back to Ireland. He tries to go off to Paris to be a great artist and comes back to Dublin. And that has elements of the Odyssey. So he's giving a lecture on Hamlet. And also Daedalus, the arch-inventor, the trickster, he's the father of Icarus, who flew too close to the sun. But Daedalus invented, or he was an inventor, and he created the labyrinth at Minos, where the Minotaur was, and he created the wings that they could fly to escape from the island. And you have these Daedalus. Telemachus is the son of Odysseus, and Odysseus is trying to get back home, but Telemachus is trapped at home with Penelope, his mother, whilst all these suitors try to seduce her. So there's a Hamlet type theme there. And also there's this concept of the missing and absent father. So, Hamnet hits you over the head with it, but the son of William Shakespeare dies, and Shakespeare is in London. He's not back at Stratford, so he's an absent father. Hamlet's father, Hamlet Jr.'s father, has just died, so the ghost comes back to him. The missing father aspect, Telemachus, as pointed out, is waiting for his father to come back. There are all these links. And then the Hamnet stuff in this lecture that Daedalus gives, he's hypothesizing about Shakespeare's son. He died 1596, and it's debated, but there's this concept of the Hamlet, the original, the earliest Hamlet, that either Shakespeare drew upon and it was written by somebody else, or Shakespeare potentially could have written it himself. But the actual published Hamlet didn't occur till, they think, 1600 to 1601. They're not quite sure. But interestingly, Shakespeare's father died in 1601. So the ghost haunting the play was also haunting Shakespeare in real life. And then this concept of, where does Hamlet actually come from, the very name? So there's this idea it's based upon Amleth, who was a trickster character from Scandinavian legend who feigns madness. I think his uncle's trying to kill him, which is a reversal of what's going on in Hamlet. So he feigns madness to escape being killed. And then you can see this is the Icelandic word, and that's used as a term for fool or simpleton, which Hamlet comes from. So the etymology is quite complicated. The Old Norse is amma and which is fierceness or madness. So to annoy, to molest, to vex, fierceness, madness, all these ideas. And then you've got the Irish similarities. And then you've got the Gaelic adaptation of the Norse Olaf, and then Olaf or Olav. You go around in this really complex etymological circle, but Anu Labeys from Anu, ancestor, grandfather. So you've got the grandfather, Hamlet Senior, of Hamnet, the son of Shakespeare, is all contained within that idea as well. And this is Harold Bloom. When Shakespeare was a boy, a young woman named Kate Hamlet, or Hamnet, because these words are interchangeable at that time, drowned herself in the Avon River near Stratford, supposedly because she was disappointed in love. What relation she might have to Ophelia, the character from Hamlet, is speculative, but any relation to Hamnet Shakespeare is only accidental. He can hardly have been named for her. Ostensibly, he was named for Shakespeare's friend Hamnet, or Hamlet Sadler, but any English Hamlet ultimately was named for the legendary Amleth, who I've just mentioned, as the bookish young Shakespeare would have known. Amleth was proverbial for his trickery, for his famed idiocy, upon which his overwhelming triumph was based. So I'm just pointing out why I'm giving you all this information is to point out how complicated the resonances are, the links, the translations that you need to do. And I'm not advising that you do see it, but if you've been unfortunate to see Hamnet the film, all of this is just dumbed down and decaffeinated and taken away. But just to break up me droning, that's John Everett Millais, Ophelia, beautiful painting from 1851. I think it's estimated 1851. So I'm just a massive fan of Harold Bloom. So to continue with him, the origins of Shakespeare's most famous play are as shrouded as Hamlet's textual condition is confused, because there are various editions of the play. There is an earlier Hamlet that Shakespeare's drama revises and overgoes, but we do not have this trial work. That's what they're referring to as the Hamlet, the original. Nor do we know who composed it. Most scholars believe that its author was Thomas Kyd, who wrote the archetypal revenge play, The Spanish Tragedy. I think, though, that Peter Alexander was correct in his surmise that Shakespeare himself wrote the Hamlet no later than 1589, when he was first starting as a dramatist. Though scholarly opinion is mostly against Alexander on this, such a speculation suggests that Hamlet, which in its final form gave its audience a new Shakespeare, may have been gestating in Shakespeare for more than a decade. Again, this notion of being haunted by an idea, which Shakespeare then is haunted by this idea that he then expresses in the play. The character in Memento is haunted. Leonard is haunted by an idea that he then refuses to express and sublimates into action to avoid having to reflect upon it. Something in and about Hamlet strikes us as demanding and providing evidence from some sphere beyond the scope of our senses. And again, this is the opposite of Memento. Leonard in Memento only relies upon the scope of his senses, photographs, notes written in his own hand. He will not engage with the evidence from some sphere beyond the scope of his senses. Hamlet's desires, his ideals or aspirations, are almost absurdly out of joint with the rancid atmosphere of Elsinore. And this shuffle off this mortal coil, this famous phrase. Shuffle to Hamlet is a verb for thrusting off this mortal coil, where coil means noise or tumult. Shuffling for Claudius, so the impostor, usurper, is a verb for mortal trickery. With a little shuffling, he tells Laertes, you can switch blades and destroy Hamlet. There is no shuffling there, Claudius yearningly says, of a heaven in which he neither believes nor disbelieves. Claudius the shuffler is hardly Hamlet's mighty opposite, as Hamlet calls him. The wretched usurper is hopelessly outclassed by his nephew. So again, just to give you, I'm trying to replicate the complexity that the film Hamnet ignores and just, I use the phrase decaffeinated, gets rid of. But also, this is almost like the subtext of what goes on in Memento. I'll give you an example, a visual example shortly, of this notion of the coil, the schema that lies behind Memento. A confused mixture, a mess of noisy, confused, uncertain things. Shuffle, this rid, discard. And then this beautiful phrase that most people know from Hamlet, to shuffle off this mortal coil. This is the way language in Shakespeare haunts the play. So shuffle off this mortal coil. Also, so I've given you the definitions, but there's also this notion of the coil could also be the concept of a serpent, and serpents shed their skins. So shuffle off this mortal coil could be the discarding of the skin of a snake. And this is the beauty. I referred earlier to the translation book of Hofstadter and George Steiner. This act of translation you have to do to get the maximum benefit from these literary creations. But no one translation is the true, unadulterated, only interpretation. And for some people, they just don't like that. They want definite answers. And I'll give you examples with reference to Memento in a second, but people want to understand the chronology of Memento exactly. And I'd argue what makes Memento a brilliant film is ultimately it's ambiguous. I don't think there is an ultimate answer. It's the answer is hidden within the tension of the genre and the unreliability of the memory, even the facts that Leonard thinks he has are suspect, never mind his failed memories of the past. So this is the way he writes on photographs. And this relates to a character called Teddy, who's a police detective, and he's saying, don't believe his lies. But Leonard had a vested interest in writing this because at a certain part of the film, Teddy tells him an uncomfortable truth about his wife. So what Memento does all the way through is keep the tension. I've used the word tension and this idea of tension before, but the tension between apparent facts and interpretation. It's a constant theme throughout the film. And I've just shown you examples from Hamlet in which there's a tension between the words and what they might mean and how simultaneous meanings may coexist. And there are no simultaneous meanings coexisting in Hamnet, by contrast. It is mono meaning all the way through. It's deceptively shallow, Hamnet. It's much more shallow than it actually seems at first appearance. And an interesting aspect of this is that he doesn't reflect upon himself, but he can see himself in reflections. And the woman behind, I think, is it Natalie? It's his girlfriend who we think is manipulating him. And he's got a tattoo on there, which I'll show you in a second. But this idea of seeing yourself in the mirror. Actually, in Memento, seeing yourself in the mirror is no closer to revealing the truth. So he's got these tattoos, and the one at the top is you have to read it. You have to look at it in the mirror to be able to read it. It's like an ambulance sign designed to be seen in the rear view mirror of a car. So I'm going to start summing up, but this is I mentioned at the very beginning, the judgment of the district judge, John M. Woolsey. And this was the day after the Prohibition Act was repealed, remember. So Joyce has attempted, it seems to me, with astonishing success to show how the screen of consciousness with its ever-shifting kaleidoscopic impressions carries, as it were, on a plastic palimpsest, not only what is in focus of each man's observation of the actual things about him, but also in a penumbral zone residual of past impressions, some recent and some drawn up by association from the domain of the subconscious. He shows how each of these impressions affects the life and behaviour of the character which he is describing. I think that is an actually brilliant description of not just Ulysses, but what happens in Memento. The kaleidoscopic impressions. You saw the memory board as the film poster. You could actually map this description onto the film Memento. What he seeks to get is not unlike the result of a double, or if that is possible, a multiple exposure on a cinema film, which would give a clear foreground with a background visible, but somewhat blurred and out of focus in varying degrees. Again, I think technically that's a description of what Nolan does in the film medium. So he's describing how Joyce is trying to do it in literature. I think Nolan does it brilliantly in the medium best suited. So Joyce is using the tension I referred to between the medium he's trying to express himself in and the fact it's not the best medium. And that's what makes him a great artist. Nolan's a great artist also for using the medium that's best at doing this. film to present this this ever-shifting kaleidoscopic impressions. With its ever-shifting kaleidoscopic impressions, that's what Nolan does. Multiple exposure on a cinema film, that's what Nolan does. And this idea, somewhat blurred and out of focus, this just concatenation of ideas and events that have to be written down. Again, this is a movie poster. Remember, what does it say? Out of focus. Blurred background, with the background visible but somewhat blurred and out of focus in varying degrees. And this again obviously is from Memento. To convey by words an effect which obviously lends itself more appropriately to a graphic technique accounts, it seems to me, for much of the obscurity which meets a reader of Ulysses. And it also explains another aspect of the book, which I have further to consider, namely, Joyce's sincerity and his honest effort to show exactly how the minds of his characters operate. If Joyce did not attempt to be honest in developing the technique which he has adopted in Ulysses, the result would be psychologically misleading and thus unfaithful to his chosen technique. Such an attitude would be artistically inexcusable. And this is just, I mentioned I'd show you. If you actually tried to plot what's happening and how the film plot is constructed, this is my favourite. Remember the coil, the mess? This is a schema much more complicated than the schema Joyce offers for Ulysses, but brilliantly done. But my question, or my point would be, this is fascinating to see how Nolan does it, but one of my criticisms of people online who try and find the ultimate meaning of the film Memento, I think they've missed the point. The point of Memento, the film, the point of Hamlet, the point of Ulysses, is the constant tension between the schematic elements from which you can help make sense of what's going on, but also the fact that those schemas aren't all-encompassing. They don't give you all the answers because there's always a layer of ambiguity that can't be captured. It is because Joyce has been loyal to his technique and has not funked its necessary implications, but has honestly attempted to tell fully what his characters think about, that he has been the subject of so many attacks, and that his purpose has been so often misunderstood and misrepresented. For his attempts sincerely and honestly to realise his objective has required him incidentally to use certain words, which are generally considered dirty words, and has led at times to what many think is a too poignant preoccupation with sex in the thoughts of his characters. And then I love this bit. The words which are criticised as dirty, 184, are old Saxon words known to almost all men, and I venture to many women, and are such words as would be naturally and habitually used, I believe, by the types of folk whose life, physical and mental, Joyce is seeking to describe. Remember, this is from the obscenity judgment. In respect of the recurrent emergence of the theme of sex in the minds of his characters, it must always be remembered that his locale was Celtic and his season spring. I just think that's funny for a judge. So you've got to expect that Celtic people are randy, and especially in springtime when the sap is rising, so to speak. Whether or not one enjoys such a technique as Joyce uses is a matter of taste, on which disagreement or argument is futile. But to subject that technique to the standards of some other technique seems to me to be little short of absurd. And this is what I was laughing at when I watched it. This is obviously the film poster. I'll give you an image from the actual film in a second. But I'd had a couple of Guinness or Guinea, I must admit. But this was, I started singing Neil Diamond, hands, hands, touching me. It's just an awful kitsch. It's from the idea is in the actual play. Hamlet's dying, and you can see the mother is at the front of the stage. She pushes herself to the front, and she touches him because she's so emotionally overcome. And then every dim-witted person in the audience, the groundlings there, copies her, and they all reach out because the play has been so affecting. Call me cynical, but it's just, like I say, Neil Diamond on steroids. Sweet Caroline, move over. And it's just so manipulative. The whole complexity, the psychoanalytical complexity, the psychology, all the linguistic complexity I've been pointing out, it's all reduced to a grief-stricken mother overcoming her grief through witnessing the play. Which, I understand that could be an element, but it's so forced and shoehorned in, that interpretation of the play, to just tie it up with a neat little bow. So I'm finishing off now with This is Jericho Tisdale. And this is just the perfect statement of the, if I had a lobotomy and was turned into a completely different person to I am now, who had all the opposing views I hold, this is the type of article I'd write. I loved Hamnet for many reasons, but the way it explores art is one of my favourites. It doesn't explore art, it destroys art. Let's talk about it. Yes, let's. I think they call it Agnes, that is pronounced in the film. It's probably Old English. But Agnes's pain becomes our pain. No, she's grieving for a child, a fictional child. I'm grieving for what you've done to art. We grieve along with her, and we also resent William. He chooses his art over his family. At least that's how it feels upon his return after Hamlet's death. Agnes sends a sort of venomous rage towards William that makes you fear that the family cannot recover from this loss. Then Hamlet happens. William pours all his grief, regrets, anguish, and remorse into this play. It allows him to atone for the missteps with his family, to apologise to Agnes and Hamnet for not being there when they needed him the most. The final scenes are transformative. They moved me to something. You feel every bit of heartache and healing in the performance of the play. You see William ask for forgiveness in it, and how Agnes accepts. It's a moment more humbling, beautiful, and loving than any moment in some of the best romantic movies. It's not a romantic bloody play. It's Hamlet. I left the film feeling a grief so alive, but mended at the end. Will earns his atonement. Yes, because that's what Hamlet's all about, a happy ending. And it's the best romantic movie you could see. I said at the very beginning about we live in illiterate times. If this is what a film critic takes from this film, actually it's actually an accurate summary of what the film's about. My disagreement with Jericho is that he endorses it. I think he's describing brilliantly what the film was actually about, so I'll give him credit for that. But this, I'll finish with Harold Bloom's rejoinder. If he'd been alive, he probably would have said something like this, which is more articulate than I can manage in my curmudgeonly response to Hamlet. Everything in the play depends upon Hamlet's response to the ghost, a response that is as highly dialectical as everything else about Hamlet. The question of Hamlet always must be Hamlet himself, for Shakespeare created him to be as ambivalent and divided a consciousness as a coherent drama could sustain. So no, it's not a romance story. No, it's not about William Shakespeare merely trying to overcome the grief of losing a child. It's much, much more complicated than that. Jericho, whatever he was called. So if you remember this, though, the idea for Shakespeare created him to be as ambivalent and divided a consciousness as coherent drama could sustain. I'll just finish on this last image. This was actually the black and white chronological strand of the narrative. And it just shows you the tension that artists who have any integrity are constantly working against. Although this was probably authorised by Christopher Nolan. But what Harold Bloom's just said about the complexity, the fractured character you can see in the image, but they've created this, again, I was going to use the phrase, but the illegitimate child version. This is imposing order. And rather than dwelling on the tension and the fragmentation of the personality that the original proper Memento is all about, just like the proper Hamlet is all about the fragmentation of the individual consciousness, there's this constant pressure from mass culture to reinforce the uniform, reinforce the easily understood, the cliched genre. And at its best, this is what Christopher Nolan rejects in Memento. It's much more complicated. This is what James Joyce completely undermines with a book as complicated as Ulysses. And it's what Hamlet was all about, this fractured consciousness. And I just hope that this isn't this tendency to reimagine the chronological, less complicated version is the mindset that Christopher Nolan brings to the Odyssey in the summer. On that hopeful note, till next time, all the very best. Take care.